Hello everyone! In this week's video, I'm showing how I draw bodies in my style. Back in the day, my channel was called Learn to Draw Manga, and I made mostly drawing tutorials, even though I still had a lot to learn. Over time, I kind of moved away from making tutorials because I grew less confident in making them. However, a lot of you request that I remake old tutorials or make new ones, so I thought I'd give it a go. This video isn't really going to be like my old tutorials where I show you step by step how I draw one thing in a specific view. Instead, we are going to go over different parts of the body and how I draw them. Then we will put all of them together. I do have an announcement that I want to say before we jump in. I want to let you know that I'm accepting original character and gacha character submissions for a future I Draw Your OC video. There's more info in the description on how to enter. And speaking of OCs, I want to thank Unveil for sponsoring this video. Join over 60,000 artists on Unveil, an inclusive community that is proudly 100% Never NFT and anti-AI art, where you can comment, favorite, and follow the artists and writers you love. You can also create, manage, and share all your original characters and worlds. A new feature has been added called the My Content page, where you can find all the characters and worlds you have shared with others. Also, new themes have been added to character pages, and I hear they plan to add even more. If you have original characters, I highly recommend checking out Unveil. I love how detailed you can make the character pages, and there are so many details you can fill out in the traits section. It really helps you flesh out your character. So go check out Unveil and start sharing your characters. There's a link in the pinned comment, and feel free to follow me on there under the name Love to Draw Manga. Now let's get into drawing. A bit of a disclaimer, this is going to be about my process and how I think of the body when I'm drawing it. Everyone has their own process, so feel free to experiment and find what works best for you. Hopefully me sharing my thought process can help work as a guide. Now you're probably thinking we're going to start with the head, but I'm sorry, I'm not going to talk in depth about the head in this video. I feel like I can make a video all on its own for that subject. So we are going to start with the torso. The torso is very important since it's kind of the base for the body and its proportions. At the most simple level, you can think of the torso as two circles or maybe like a sack. The torso can bend, turn, and stretch. And with these movements, the circles move and tilt in different directions. So yeah, circles are a great simple way to think of the torso, but obviously it's much more complicated than that. So let's go into a bit more detail. The upper circle basically represents the rib cage. I often simplify this as a kind of circular shape that goes up in the middle. I often draw the top kind of flat because it helps me imagine the collarbone. The bottom circle represents the hips. I often draw it as kind of an underwear-like shape, since this shape helps me place the legs. In between these, we have this empty space, and I like to think of this area as the stretchy area. It's the area that can bend and twist. The ribs and hips aren't very stretchy, so I think of this area as where we can get more movement out of the torso. If you play around with the shapes and ratios you use for the rib cage and hips, you can get very different torso shapes. I recommend playing around with different shapes and sizes to see what kind of different torsos you can make. For the torso in different views, we have the front, which I already explained. For the side, I draw kind of a rounded shape for the ribs. And for the hips, it's kind of an underwear from the side kind of shape. I feel like that's the best way I can describe it. I draw a shape that kind of curves in the middle, and it goes down on each side. For the back, it is similar to the front, but I don't draw the ribs going up in the middle, and the bottom of the underwear shape is more flat since it's representing the bum. Now that we've gone over the torso, let's draw it in action. Speaking of action, this is my line of action. It's a line I draw for where I think the center of the body will be, and I have it curve in the way I want the torso to move. The torso is going to be arched, pinching in on the right side. When drawing the ribs and hips, I try to remember that these are 3D shapes. To help me remember this, I often draw the top or bottom edge of the shape. In this case, we are looking at the ribs from below, so we can see a bit of the underside of them. By drawing the circle for the underside, it helps me see the rib cage as more of a 3D form. Now for the hips, they're going to be tilting down a bit, so we are going to see the top side of them. Once again, I indicate this with a circle to show the top edge. Now obviously ribs and hips don't really have bottom and top edges like this, but it helps me visualize them. Now that we have the basic shapes in place, I use the liquify tool to move them around a bit to my liking, and then start going in with more detail. I do want to point out a small detail, and it is this small line that shows the line of the rib cage. This line can really help add form to the torso, especially in poses like this where the ribcage would be sticking out a bit. I draw a flat line where the ribcage is and then go into more soft lines to show the softness of the rest of the shape. On the right side, I kind of exaggerate where the torso pinches in. Don't be afraid to push things a bit with your drawings. This is often what makes them feel more lively. A lot of times as artists, we have to push things a little bit to get the point across. I feel like we've talked enough about the torso, so how about we move on to the arms? For me, the arms in their most basic form are kind of two cylinder-like shapes with circles for the joint areas. And technically I should have added a joint for the shoulder, but we will get to that in a bit. I sometimes simplify it as a circle, but not always. So arms can be ridiculously complicated. And if you want to draw very muscular arms, you will want to know these very well, but a lot of times you can get away with simplifying the forms. The most important muscles you need to know the most often are the deltoid, biceps, and triceps for the back of the arm. Like I said, the arm for me is most often two cylinder-like shapes with circles for the joints, but something else that really helps me when drawing the arms is triangles. When drawing an arm that is bent, you often end up with a kind of triangle-like shape if you connect all the joints. And for some reason, this triangle tip really helps me with arms because it helps me line up the wrist with the shoulder, and they pretty much always line up together. Like with the torso, I try to think of these shapes as 3D. So when needed, I will often draw flat circles on the bottom or top of the shapes to help me remember its form. This is especially helpful for the wrist area. It always helps me get a better sense of how to connect the hand to the forearm. Now with arms, we also get the shoulders. They are really important since they connect the arms with the torso. When drawing the shoulders, I always keep in mind the trap muscle. It is a muscle that wraps around the backside of the neck. I often simplify this area and think of the deltoid as coming off of this. I drew them a bit small here, but you get the idea. Now I know I keep calling the upper arm and forearm cylinders, but they do have more of a flow to them than that. They often go out and then in by the elbow, and then back out and then in by the wrist. So they kind of flow out, in, out, in. Now that we've discussed the arms, let's draw them in action. One arm is going to be out to the side and the other will be raised. I start out with the shoulder area with the trap muscle and the deltoids are coming off of that. Something I didn't talk too much about is the collarbone. I draw it as two lines that come from the center and head back towards where the deltoids kind of start. For the inner arm area, I often indicate it with two little lines, but sometimes I use one solid line. It kind of just depends on the pose and what feels best. As I mentioned before, we kind of have that out and in flow to the arm. Raised arms can be tricky to draw. I make sure to have the collarbone raised as well to follow what the arm is doing. And this is a major simplification, but I often find that for raised arms, it helps if I think of this area as all kind of one thing that is moving with the arm and wrapping into the shoulder. Then we have the under part of the arm coming off from behind this area where we go into the elbow and forearm. So yeah, that's how I draw arms. And here's me kind of showing the simplified structure, as well as that triangle shape I talked about. And of course, we can't have arms without the hands. Now, hands could be their own video just like the head, but I figured I would briefly talk about them and give some tips. For me, the palm is the most important part of the hand. If I can't figure out the palm, I can't figure out everything else. A lot of times people will draw the palm as a rounded square shape. I personally prefer to draw a square shape that bumps out a bit. This helps me visualize the thumb pad and thumb placement. If you want to improve at drawing hands, I recommend trying to draw this shape of the palm in many different positions and views. Having a good base for the hand really helps when it comes to placing the fingers. Speaking of fingers, let's talk about them a bit. For me, I think of fingers as 3 cylinders with little circles for the joints. I'll draw the cylinders at different angles to help me form the fingers. But there's also something else I often do when drawing fingers. I make the top side flat and the bottom side rounded. This helps me keep the finger from looking like a sausage and like it has more form. So let's draw a few different hands here. For this hand, the thumb is going to be away from us. So that bump out for the thumb pad will be kind of behind the form of the palm in the front. I also draw little lines to indicate the knuckles of the fingers. Then I draw the fingers, remembering to keep the tops flat and the bottoms more rounded. And one of the fingers is kind of peeking up from behind. Then we add the thumb. A little note about the thumb is that artists often exaggerate how much it curves. Once again, this makes it feel a bit more lively. Now I know I keep talking about the bump out on the palm, but for some positions I don't draw it. And that's because the thumb pad can move inwards, so we don't really have the bump out anymore. So that's something to keep in mind. Lastly, I want to talk a bit about simplification. When drawing hands, I don't always draw each finger. I will often group the middle and ring finger together in a more simple shape with the line down the middle, especially if the hands are being drawn smaller. I'll even group in the pinky or pointer finger in this sometimes. This can be a nice way to simplify the hand and make it easier to draw. But this kind of posing also often looks pleasing to the eye and is used very often in art. So that was my short breakdown on hands. Now let's move on to the legs. Funny enough, the legs in their simplest form are very similar to the arms, two cylinder-like shapes with circles for the joints. Technically, the hip is another joint, but I rarely use circles to indicate it. The flow of the leg is once again similar to the arm, where it goes in by the knee, back out, and in by the ankle. I tend to make the flow more noticeable on the outer edge and more flat on the inner edge. And on the inner side, I'll often indicate the knee a bit more. When drawing the leg in side view, something that really helps me is to remember that the leg likes to curve out at the front top, but then goes more flat. However, the back of the leg is the opposite. It is flat on the top and curves out at the bottom. This of course doesn't only apply to side view, I often apply it to other views as well. Remembering this flow really helps when it comes to drawing the legs and making them have a nice flow. Oh, also when drawing legs from behind, for me it's basically the same thing, I just draw little lines where the knees usually go. The legs have a lot of muscles, but unless you are drawing someone that heavily focuses on working their legs, you often won't need to draw them too much. You can get away with drawing very simple shapes. When drawing legs, I often think of this muscle group as all being one thing. The other areas that are important to me are the knee, calf muscles, and the shin bone. This bone is often pretty prominent and can help define the lower leg shape, so I'll often indicate it with a line. But with legs also comes feet. And we aren't going to talk too long about these because I most often majorly simplify these. For front view, I draw a triangle with a boxy shape for the arch area, a rounded shape for the toes, and the arch kind of wraps around the back. It's easier to understand in side view. We have the kind of pointy shape that becomes a box for the arch, the rounded shape for the toes, and the rounded shape for the heel. I basically just practiced drawing these simple shapes in different views so that I can draw feet at different positions. I often use variations of these shapes for breaking down and drawing shoes as well. We have the arch, heel, and toe. It's a very simple way to break down these more complicated forms. Now obviously if you're drawing feet without socks or shoes, things are a bit more complicated. You have the toes, and I have to say I'm definitely not an expert at this. When I do need to draw feet, I often just draw the big toe. Once again, it's kind of flat on one side and round on the other. And I group the other toes into kind of a large shape and carve them out. I wish I could give more specific tips for this, but I feel like with feet, I'm often kind of winging it. So I don't have much for specific tips on these. So sorry about that. But with all of that explained, we can now put everything together. So when drawing the body, I use the head as my base unit of measurement. I often make the torso anywhere from 2 to 3 heads in length, depending on the gender and age. This time I'm aiming for about 2 heads in length, which is very stylized. A lot of times the upper body, counting the head, is 4 heads in length for adults, but this can vary from person to person. Now for the arms, the base measurement I often use is for them to be about the same length as the torso. Sometimes I draw them slightly longer or shorter depending on what feels right. Sometimes art is less about following the rules and is more about what you think looks good. The elbows go at about the halfway point, and for the hands I often try to make them about the same length as the face. Once you have the proportions for your upper body figured out, it's pretty easy to figure out the lower body. The standard measurement I use is the legs are the same length as the upper body. This is the torso plus the head. Like I said, this can vary at times depending on the body type I am drawing, but this is the basic measurement I use. The line down here is where the heels rest. When I was young and people would say the legs are the same length as the upper body, I would get confused as to whether or not this includes the feet, and eventually I found that I get a good result if I think of the heel as resting on this line. So here's the body in front view, but I thought I should also demonstrate the side view. A little note is that when connecting the neck to the body, I draw it at an angle. The neck doesn't come straight out the top of the torso, hence the angle. Also, when drawing the ribcage, I often draw it slightly tilted. This angle can change depending on posture, but if a person is standing up straight, I draw this kind of angle. For the lower body, to help line up the heels, I often draw a line coming off the back of the character and place the heels around that line. This helps keep me from placing the heels not under the character. In side view, instead of drawing the arms super straight, I tend to draw them with a slight bend to make them more relaxed or natural feeling. Now I'm going to be honest, I often don't like drawing people in these super static poses. They always feel a bit off to me. So how about we end things with drawing a more fluid pose? I wanted to show you this footage because I feel like it shows you my process in a more natural state. When drawing and showing things in tutorials, my technique always changes a bit and I don't draw as naturally as I usually do because I'm kind of overthinking it. So I thought I should end this video of showing myself drawing all the different parts together how I usually do when I'm not in tutorial mode. These tips aren't really related to anatomy, but when I'm sketching digitally, I like to zoom in on my canvas so that I am drawing smaller. I also use a larger brush to encourage me to draw looser. I'm not trying to go into detail yet, and by using a larger brush and zooming in on my canvas, I'm more encouraged to not go into detail yet. Right now, I'm not worrying too much about proportions. Instead, I'm trying to get more of the basics in place and the overall feeling of the pose. Once I'm happy with my sketch, I make it larger, switch to a smaller brush, and start refining things more. This is where I start to define more details, and I'm thinking more about defining different shapes and forms. If you look closely, you can see that I stray from my rough sketch. This is often because I'm trying to draw parts more in proportion, or trying to make things look more correct in my eyes. Drawing anatomy is very tricky. It's something I've been working at for a long time, so make sure to be patient with yourself. It's not something you can learn overnight. But I hope this overview video of how I draw anatomy was a bit helpful and that you can apply some of these tips to your own art. If there's anything you'd like me to go into more detail about, please let me know. And if there are any other topics you'd like me to cover in a video like this one, please let me know down in the comments. Before we end, I want to thank my super fantastic YouTube members and Patreon patrons for their support. It means so much to me. And thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next week in my next video. Bye!